The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
I am back, and you are comfortably zoned with me, the Zigzag Man, in Alameda, California, right across the bay from San Francisco. And I am thrilled to have a return guest today. It's been a couple of weeks, and his voice has resonated in my head. Mostly, I must admit, because I'm an old New York Giant fan, grew up in New York, and just was so in love. My cathedral was the Polo Grounds. My happiest memory of childhood was going to said Polo Grounds with my grandfather virtually every day of the baseball season when I was between the ages of 4 and 6. And on Saturdays, it was Ladies' Day. We took my grandmother at times, and my guest wrote the definitive book about the Polo Ground, the Polo Grounds, and the Giants of those days. And today I'm going to introduce him as the revised Noel Hynd, because I don't know where I came up with that, but we're going to talk about his revised edition and what he added to his work on the Polo Grounds. Noel, welcome back. Excuse my rambling. I'm just excited as hell to have you back.
Thank you very much. I appreciate being here. So let's chat. Go ahead.
Yeah, beautiful. First of all, tell me what year, remind me, I think it was in the 80s when you published the book, and tell me how the revision came about. Did you approach the publisher? Did they approach you? What was going on there?
Well, I can honestly say that the revised edition is 30-some years in the making, because I started on the original edition. I may have mentioned the last time I was on your show that I lived in New York City in the mid-'80s, and I used to go out to run. I lived at 68th and 3rd, and I'd head over to Central Park and the Reservoir maybe about midday when the sun was out, and I'd always be running past this art gallery on Madison Avenue. And this guy had all of this great art to sell, most of it modern, in his window. And then down at the bottom of the window, there was a picture of the 1955 Brooklyn Dodgers championship team, which I guess he considered a work of art. His opinion, of course. Couldn't have been too many Yankee fans happy about it walking past. Nonetheless, I kept going past and thinking, why doesn't someone write a book about the New York Giants? They've been forgotten. So to make a long story short, I sent the idea to my agent. I did an outline, and it promptly got rejected just about everywhere because I was a writer of espionage fiction at the time. Within the next couple of years, I had sold a couple of articles to Sports Illustrated, and I was in the magazine not as a staff writer, but as an outside contributor every couple of months or so, every few weeks. So the same agent went back to the same editors at the same publishing companies and said, forget about the espionage novels. This guy's a writer for Sports Illustrated. So Doubleday agreed to publish it, and we had a very good edition of 10,000 copies in hardcover and sold them out in typical publishing fashion. The publisher then did absolutely nothing, even after the book being editor's choice in the New York Times and on the right next to the bestseller list for 3 Sundays in a row. So
wow. That had to feel pretty good.
That part was good, but it was immensely frustrating with Doubleday because at one point they said, go out, make as many publicity contacts as you can. So I did. So as I may have mentioned in the other blog that we did, I was on Art Rust's show from Macy's Basement in New York with Ed Kranepool and Ira Burka of the New York Times. times. So we were doing really well. And then the publisher PR department called me one time and said, would you stop having people asking for review copies? They actually wanted me to stop promoting the book because they were too cheap to send out copies. It was mind-boggling.
Wow.
But nonetheless, and then flash forward to earlier in this year, 2018, or wherever we are. It still sounds like science fiction to me, a year like that. But earlier in the year, I thought, I never have done, I have my own publishing imprint right now. I can publish what I want. And that is the one book I've never had time to go back and do a reissue of. And I figured I'll take a couple of weeks and I'll just go through and, fix things up a little, adapt it for mostly digital publishing. And it took me 10 months because I started to reread and realize, I missed part of the story in the 1920s. Not so much what was on the field, I got that part right, but what was going on behind the scenes, what guys like George M. Cohan were doing in the World War I era. With raising money. George M. Cohan was a huge New York Giants fan and a friend of John McGraw. And one time he came to the ballpark to raise money for survivors of the Titanic. It was like a week after the catastrophe at sea. And there's a picture of Cohen going around selling newspapers in the ballpark with a newsboy following him. Well, 8 months later, the newsboy was involved in a prominent murder case in Manhattan. So none of that in the first edition, but plenty of that in the second edition. And there were all of these guys like Arnold Rothstein, who allegedly fixed the 1919 World Series, lurking in the backgrounds. And I don't just mean ominous stuff. You had Jimmy Walker, who was a great New York Giants fan. I barely mentioned him in the first edition, but I'm all over his case in the second edition. As you know, Walker was the mayor of New York in the 20s and was kind of the iconic symbol of New York along with Babe Ruth in the 20s. Walker, of course, had to flee to England to avoid process servers toward the end of his administration. So I get into a lot of that, and I get into it with sort of a wink and a smile because, let's face it, we're New Yorkers. We sort of know how things work, how things went down. And so this is kind of a looser, longer, shall we say, more discursive edition, but there's really some absolutely fascinating stuff in there.
Well, one of the stories, I know it's fascinating because one of the stories you alluded to off air, and that is your chapter on celebrities, or your chapters on celebrities who were great Giant fans and went to the Polo Grounds in those days. I came up with the names Jackie Gleason and Frank Sinatra, but you came up with one fascinating person, and that was, tell me about Tallulah Bankhead. And,
Tallulah Bankhead, who a lot of people have forgotten today, was an A-list star of her generation. She lived, I think, into the 1960s. She worked with Clark Gable. She worked with Hitchcock. She was in, I believe, the film Lifeboat. She was a fascinating lady from Alabama who, like a lot of people who are famous, who find fame in New York, really became a consummate New Yorker, even though they weren't born there. She was a huge New York Giants fan. It is alleged or reputed that she had a romance with Mel Ott when he was a player in the 40s with the Giants. And I think one of the most colorful incidents about her was how one summer she was on Broadway. Tallulah was a star of both movies and Broadway. And she smoked about 4 or 5 packs a day, by the way, which is why and it caught up with her eventually also, as you might imagine it would. I mean,
no one gets out alive.
No, those cigarettes weren't even filtered back then. And she always had one. It was almost as part of her, like Groucho with the cigar, Tallulah with the cigarette.
Now an unfiltered cigarette is a totally different connotation, and things have changed. You mentioned she dated Mel Ott.
So I'm told, yes, and I believe it was in her autobiography.
Now, is it true that there was a crossword puzzle thing? Tallulah Bankhead dated 3 down in the crossword puzzle. Mel Ott is always, that's how people remember him today. He's always the perfect crossword puzzle name. But when I was a kid growing up, a Giant fan, and this is when Willie was first starting in the big leagues, Mel Ott held the home run record for right-handed batters in baseball, in all of baseball. Hit over 500, later went on to manage the Giants. He himself is one of the most overlooked superstars in history. When an historian looks back and players are talked about, Aaron and Wright, Mason Center, great all-star teams of their eras and what have you. He's overlooked, and I want to know how come he was so overlooked, has been so overlooked, because he really was a superstar.
Absolutely. I think one thing that has worked against him was the fact that the foul, he could hit the ball down the line either way, and the foul lines, as you know, were well under 300 feet, both in left field and right field in the Polo Grounds. He hit a lot of home runs in the home ballpark, and a lot of people used that against him, even though those same foul lines were there for every other player of his generation. But Mel Ott retired. I think he was maybe second or third with home run totals, certainly behind Ruth, but perhaps behind Jimmy Fox at the time. And
yeah, but I'm talking right-handed hitters. Maybe Fox was a right-handed hitter too, but again, they get much more acclaim, and
they get much more. Yeah, I think people said, well, people seem to conjecture that anybody could have hit all those home runs with friendly foul lines like that in the Polo Grounds, and he was the only one that did, so you have to give him credit for it. And he was just as dangerous a hitter on the road as at the Polo Grounds. So it's like a lot of people of that generation in either baseball or boxing. I mean, how many people remember what a great fighter Benny Leonard was, for example? His name is, you really have to be a boxing expert to even know the name. And, time moves on. Current stars replace the older stars, and there's just not that appreciation. It's one of the things I enjoyed so much about doing the expanded version of the book, because I was able to get into a lot of those people.
Okay, one of those people that does get that comes to mind when everybody talks about the managerial links and who it's McGraw is one. Another one is Branch Rickey that they talk about. Leo DeRocher, and all those links. McGraw had more guys come down than anyone, including the aforementioned Mel Ott and superstar Bill Terry. And he was a great manager who had terrific success with the Giants. We don't know as much about him as we do, say, Casey Stengel, for instance. What did you learn from writing the book that surprised you, and was there anything that you revised in your revised edition? Was there anything that related to McGraw?
There was nothing new that I had that related to McGraw. I maybe expanded some of the incidents, gave a few more details. It was easier to research now with the Internet. The problem, of course, is there's I can't think of anybody alive who knew John McGraw personally. McGraw died in 1933, 1934, so that's about 80 years ago. Back when I wrote the book the first time, I had the pleasure of speaking with Carl Hubble, who had obviously played for him, and didn't remember him very affectionately, let's put it that way. He did concede. He said, well, they didn't just call him the Little Napoleon, he was the Little Napoleon. But of course, Hubble came up late in McGraw's career. In fact, one of the criticisms of the first book was I spent too much time on McGraw. But of course, McGraw, no pun intended, was the giant of the franchise. He was the persona of the team. He managed for 30 years. Nobody managed a team longer than McGraw other than Connie Mack, who managed for 50.
Who owned the team, as a matter of fact.
He couldn't fire himself.
Right.
Well, he could, but he didn't. So I had to go the first time with a lot of material on McGraw. What you've touched on, though, is something very interesting, which is McGraw's legacy, because Casey Stengel played for the Giants in the McGraw era, and Casey Stengel would sit on the bench when he was a somewhat older player and confer with McGraw and go over strategy with McGraw. He was basically like in the role that Don Zimmer was in with Joe Torre with the Yankees. And Casey learned from McGraw. I think he frequently said that in the 50s or 60s. Everything I knew, I learned from McGraw about shifts, about relief pitchers, about lefty-righty stuff. And then think how many people were descendants of Stengel. Billy Martin, of course, comes to mind. So you can actually see that managerial lineage going all through 20th century and into 21st century baseball. And it all started with McGraw coming from Baltimore in 1903 and grabbing a absolutely horrible franchise that was being run into the ground by a guy named Andrew Friedman, who, if there's a Baseball Hall of Shame, he should be one of the initial members, because the Giants in the 80s and 90s, 1880s, 1890s, were a very competitive team, and basically Friedman just raped the franchise, didn't know what he was doing, fought with everybody. And McGraw was hired by Friedman, came in, took over the team, and rescued it.
Okay, where did McGraw get his baseball acclaim or knowledge, or did he have a mentor, I wonder?
He had, and I'm blanking on the guy's name now, but it was in my book. He had a guy who was, I think the man's last name was Lawson, who was an aspiring ball player, but better known as an early aviator and a business guy, who was McGraw's mentor when McGraw was, I think, still a teenager in upstate New York, who brought him into the minor league system. And Lawson didn't so much teach McGraw so much as he gave him the opportunity. And I believe McGraw in his first game at third base made something like 5 errors or something. It was not an auspicious start. But in terms of McGraw's managerial genius, and it was nothing short of that, I'm reminded a little bit of a question that was once asked to Stephen King, the writer of horror movies and horror books. King was asked, was there anything that happened to you when you were a kid that sort of sent you in this direction? And he thought about it for a second. He says, no, meaning it was just in there. It was just in the psyche. And my reading of John McGraw is that he was put into a situation in baseball, and his mind was easily adapted to it. well suited to, educate himself on the sport and develop his own strategies.
Okay. An innovator for sure.
Yes, right down to ingenious ways to cheat, because McGraw was, when he was with the Baltimore Orioles in the latter part of the 19th century, McGraw came up with the trick of hiding an extra ball in the outfield in case somebody hit a ball between the two outfielders. An outfielder would just go over and pick up the one that he had stashed out there. And McGraw also used the belt trick at third base. When someone was going to tag up or try to go home, he'd come up right behind the player and hold the opposing player's belt. It was the time when there were only one or maybe two umpires with the game, so he would get away with that.
Sounds like the NBA.
You could make that case. Anything
right?
goes. Yep.
Anything goes as long as the ref doesn't see it, and no harm, no foul.
Well, in the NHL, anything goes even if the ref does see it. So
right,
there you go.
That's true. And a lot of times, it's what goes is purely dependent on how the ref plays it in the NFL. I mean, they determine the flow of. I was a big hockey fan as a kid, and I always realized that the refs really control that game. There was never a scandal, never a betting scandal in the NFL like there have been with, or in NHL, like there was with basketball throughout the years. But I always suspected that things weren't always on the up and up. That's just an editorial comment as an old-time sports fan. And a New Yorker, so I've got that cynicism going for me.
Well, you probably remember the college basketball fixes of the early 50s.
Oh, absolutely, and the 60s too.
Yeah.
It's something that's going on, and probably will, given the fact that it's an inner-city game. Just a few years ago, an NBA ref got busted. And so it proves that, that it's out there and it isn't a managed. It isn't in our imagination. The man that comes to mind is Connie Hawkins. And you may be familiar with Bob Wolf. Who was it that wrote that book? It was he wrote a great book on Connie Hawkins and the times that he lived in, and the scandals with Roger Brown and all of those things. He ended up giving the best years of his basketball life playing almost anonymously in the old ABA. Later got into the NBA, but scandals are a part of it. As a matter of fact, a fellow podcaster on this network, Hal Bach, wrote a book called Banned about all the people who have been banned from baseball over the years.
There's a lot of them. Yeah.
A lot of them, and he put a beautiful book together. And it's just corporate greed is just an extension of it all. As if it didn't go on in the old days, certainly goes on today, but it's nothing new, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. And sports is a big corporate deal. So
my father, as I mentioned on the earlier podcast, was a true crime writer from the 20s into the 1960s. And in terms of betting on sports, he once said to me, "Never bet on anything that can talk."
In other words, a horse is different, and that's a great expression.
The horse is different, but the jockey is not. A slot machine or a roulette wheel might be have some warp to it, but it can't be bribed. So I think that's where he was going on that.
Oh, okay, I got you. Yeah, the jockey cannot, and the trainers cannot. That's another thing with doping the horses and this, that, and the other thing. What is your? I never asked you how it is you. Maybe I did and forgot how it is that you write. Do you set an appointment with yourself to write for X number of hours, or do you jot down stuff and then transcribe it later as you think of it? How do you stay disciplined? How does a writer stay disciplined from your standpoint?
It's damned hard. I wish I were more disciplined. The only thing that really works for me is to sort of build a momentum on whatever I'm trying to do. And I try, for example, very hard to try to arrange certain times of the day when I think, okay, right now I got a 10 o'clock such and such a morning, 10:30 every week, every morning. I'm going to try to push aside everything else and, get to the word processor and put some pages up. But life interferes, there's always a doctor's appointment or something. So
right.
Traditionally, the best time I've used to have is sort of late at night when the phone doesn't ring and when it's unlikely that I'm going to go out and have to do an errand or something. Really, just trying to get something done every day is really the best I can do, and some days that doesn't happen either. Case in point, just in the last couple of years, my sister had a health crisis in Connecticut, so I'm going back and forth between California and Connecticut. I managed to tear a Achilles tendon last year, and that takes time for doctor's appointments and rehab. And I know it sounds like everybody's falling apart. And then my wife finally had surgery in August of this year. Well, it was a 2-month fight with an insurance company before the operation was approved. So how you maintain a daily schedule with all of this going on is very
along with living in a world where your insurance company is giving medical advice to the doctor of when he or she can operate, because it's those people that are wagging the dog in the medical community.
Oh, yeah.
So
absolutely.
It's a screwed up world.
Yeah, absolutely. To answer your question is I try to discipline myself, but I fail almost every day. If I've got like 10 things I want to do in a day, if I get 8 of them done, great. I'm ahead of the game. However, the flip side of this is somehow everything gets done. Usually never within the time frame that I had hoped to get it done, but eventually everything gets done anyway.
Good. What is the post-writing of a book experience like for you? Selling it, getting out to book signings. Do you find it to be exhilarating, or do you find it to be a big pain in the ass?
The answer to your question is yes. Both. It can be both. For example, this last week, I was over in Surprise, Arizona, invited by a gentleman who was a member of the New York Giants Historical Society, and the invitation was, we've got some people living here who are from New York and who followed the Giants when they were in New York and also in San Francisco. So they'd love to meet you and buy some books. So fortunately it's a short flight. So I went over there. I was over there for 2 days, and it was absolutely wonderful. It took nice care of me, and I met some fascinating people. Among the fascinating people I met was a guy named Eddie Logan Jr., who was the last bat boy of the New York Giants at the Polo Grounds. So stuff like that is really...
the son of the famous Eddie Logan,
yes,
who was the longtime clubhouse manager. And I read on your Facebook account that you met him, and I put in the back of my mind to ask you whether or not he talked about the apartment that his dad had in the Polo Grounds when he was a kid growing up.
Well, we did talk about that, but the apartment belonged to Matty Schwab. Actually, the apartment belonged to Stoneham. The family that was living in the apartment was the groundskeeper. Matthew
okay.
Schwab.
I thought it was low. Okay, I didn't remember that correctly.
It's interesting you mentioned that because I held up a picture, which is in the revised edition of the Giants of the Polo Grounds, and I said, Eddie, you got to remember that. And he said, oh yeah, that's I was in that place many times. We'd go in and have lunch. He and the other kids with who were sort of hanging, part of the Giants family. There were kids who would hang around and
bad
around.
Boys, ball boys, sibling clubhouse guys, that sort of thing.
I said to Eddie, go ahead.
No, I want you to continue, please.
I said to Eddie, you have to realize that you had the job that I would have loved to have at your age. And he said the visiting bat boy actually had the better job because he got to meet all the players from the other teams. And when you stop and think about it, a bat boy for the visiting team at the Polo Grounds in the 1950s, do you realize how many Hall of Famers you would have met with all those great Dodgers, Hank Aaron, Matthews, Clemente. Anyway, so
absolutely.
Maybe
guys like guys that you think about that you just mentioned, for instance, they were in their heyday before the Giants moved in '57. It really was a slap in the face to New York when they lost their National League franchises, both in 1 year. And just not seeing Willie in his first prime. He had 2 or 3 different primes, the way I look at his career. But just not, for me as a kid, between 1957 and basically 1962, when he'd come back to visit when the Mets were formed. But I moved out here in '66, so I got to see him plenty out here. But that's it didn't make up for it because you lose your franchise as a kid, and it scars you for life. It's a big loss. You could poo-poo it. Well, it's a baseball team, this, that, and the other thing. But there were a lot of folks who were damaged by either losing the Giants or the Dodgers because they were kids, and kids don't know about the business side of it. It was a disgrace, let's put it that way. And the Mets replaced it. I might have mentioned this to you. I became a Met fan. They replaced the Giants and Dodgers, but it was never the same. That rivalry was incredible. And like I say, the happiest times of my youth were sitting in the right field grandstand, 20 feet from Don Mueller, and I loved it. So that's why talking to you is really fun for me.
Did you ever get a home run ball out there? You personally?
Oh, did I ever hit a home run ball?
Did you ever
catch a home run?
Did you ever?
Oh no. Okay. As a matter of fact, I think we were in the foul territory, if I'm not mistaken. So it wouldn't have been a home run. But I only caught one ball, and that's a long story, and I won't bore you with it, but Joe Pignatano hit a ground ball to me when he was with the Mets in batting practice, and I reached over and picked it up, and I will bore you. I changed my mind. An usher comes up to me well before the game started. He says, I'm not going to promise you anything, but if you give me that ball, I'm going to give it to a kid, disabled kid in a wheelchair, and I'm going to try to get you a broken bat. I said, well, I could always catch another ball in my life, but I'm never going to get an opportunity for a broken bat. I was like 15, 16 years old, and I gave him the ball, and he comes back with a broken bat that had, I didn't realize it later, but there was a guy signing autographs in that little thing down the third base line, that little curvature there, and it was Kenny Hubbs. I didn't realize I had his bat, but I went over and got his autograph on a scorecard, and tragically, a year later, it was like Rookie of the Year. He died in an airplane crash. The bat, that's another long story. I knew my mother would throw it out when I went into the Air Force, so I gave it to my buddy Marty, who does a podcast on this network with me on the Mets all these years later. I gave it to my buddy, and because his mother could be trusted, she threw it out too. She didn't know. I can't blame her, really. But that's my Kenny Hubbs Polo Ground story and catching a ball. I would have loved to catch a real a ball hit off the bat. You know, that's every kid's dream, but that never happened. But I got the batting practice thing, and I got the memory, and I remember it was Joe Pignatano. See the little weak dribble of foul down to the stands, and there you go. What memories have I evoked for you in your baseball fandom today?
Well,
listen, you talk a little bit rather than me.
One of the things you mentioned, obviously, when you're talking about the absence of the Giants in New York, and then, with the Willie Mays playing, obviously, for San Francisco, and then we were talking about getting home run balls. I went in 1962, I guess. Yeah, it was 1962, to a Saturday doubleheader between the Giants and the Mets. And it was the first weekend the Giants had been back in New York since they left in 1957. And I sat out there in left field in the upper deck in home run territory, and all I can remember is all of the Giants hitting balls up there, and have had a tremendous mixed reaction. But every couple of innings, I think Harvey Keene hit 2 home runs that day, and somebody else hit a couple. All day there was sort of balls coming as projectiles into a very, very packed upper deck. It was kind of exciting, but at the same time, it was really weird looking down in that field and seeing the Giants in a visiting uniform. I was so far out in left field that you couldn't see that. You couldn't see the SF on the cap that well. You just saw the orange insignia or logo. But it was obviously the
And you
Giants.
saw the bill on top, the little cap on top of the little bill, not the bill, what do they call it? The little button on top of the cap was orange.
Yes, yeah. So it was the Giants, but it wasn't the Giants. And, of course, they were back with a completely different team. Mays was there, obviously, and got tremendous ovation from both Met fans and Giants fans. But then, the new names, Cepeda, McCovey, it was weird. It was sort of like running into your ex-wife and meeting whoever she was going out with at the time or something. It was just a very, very weird experience. And, of course, the Nets...
Reminds me of a Frank Sinatra joke. If you ever run into Rosemary... I can't think of the columnist. Dorothy Kilgallen. He says, if you ever run into Dorothy Kilgallen, make sure you're driving.
That's Frank.
That was Frank. A delightful man. Not so, but what a terrific stage that man had. You know, we can't judge our heroes by our musical heroes, our baseball heroes. You have to judge them by their talent sometimes. You have to realize that the person that they are rarely coincides with why we worship them for other reasons. And so with that in mind, and we just mentioned Willie McCovey. He passed away earlier last week. And he was the quintessential San Francisco Giant. He's remembered 80 times more popular than anybody who ever played in San Francisco. And I'd like to ask you a question that very few people broach nowadays. Did the Giants, when in their last year or so, hold back on guys? Like they had the Alous, they had so many guys coming up in the farm system, Davenport and what have you. It was so bad in '57. Had they played those guys, it might have been more difficult for them to move, for Stoneham to justify moving if they brought those guys up a little earlier. Does that make sense? Has anybody ever mentioned that to you, or did you ever think about that?
Well, there's always been a lot of theories about did the Giants have to go, and what if this, and what if the new stadium had been built in New York, in Queens or something. And to my mind, having looked at this for 50-some years, it all comes back to one thing. O'Malley wanted to go, and O'Malley was taking Stoneham with him. And it really begins there and it ends there. And in my opinion, O'Malley played Stoneham and O'Malley played the city. And no matter what was going on with the Giants were going to, if Stoneham was under O'Malley's spell to leave, then they were going. It reminded me of when George Steinbrenner, when the question was before Steinbrenner of whether to re-sign Reggie Jackson, and he never offered Jackson a new contract. So it just wasn't going to happen. So
I suggest that the Giants went to Minneapolis first. They were supposed to move there, and then O'Malley got the deal and realized that if you're going to move to the West Coast, you can't make it a one-stop trip. You got to have these, early days of flying and what have you. So he brought him with him to San Francisco. But I think the Giants were pretty much gone to Minneapolis before Stoneham or O'Malley got involved.
The possibility was there, but I'm not sure that they would have gone to Minneapolis. And really, when O'Malley came out to Los Angeles and started to see the land that they would give him and the deal that the city would make, Minneapolis didn't have a chance of getting the Giants. Obviously, they got the Senators a few years later, but there was a lot of talk around. I mean, there was even talk after the Giants and Dodgers left about New York. I guess stealing is the word. New York started to make inquiries of whether they could move the Cincinnati Reds to New York or the Phillies.
Pittsburgh too, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes,
I think
that rings a bell. So there were a lot of hypotheticals going around, But when I went back and sort of looked at the situation, I really didn't see that much tangible about the Giants really making the move to Minneapolis. What could have happened was as soon as O'Malley got wind of the Giants being interested, he realized that, if you work Stoneham right, that team's going to move. So I can enable my move to Los Angeles by getting Horace to move to San Francisco. So what the Giants had in the farm team, in the minor leagues, I don't think really would have made that much difference. And don't forget that the neighborhood around the Polo Grounds, nobody wanted to talk about this, but a lot of white people were just afraid to go to a game, particularly at night, because the reputation of that area of Harlem back then was not a good one. And, one time years and years ago, I met the historian of the Baseball Hall of Fame, a guy named Lee Allen, and he was visiting my father because Lee Allen was looking for advice on a crime story he wanted to write about, and we talked a little bit of baseball. I think this was in the 1960s, and he turned to me and said, one of the real reasons the Giants and the Dodgers left was they couldn't guarantee their box seat customers' safety in the ballpark. He said it's a little more colorfully than that. But you had incidents of people being held up while they were sitting in their seats. And, of course, there was a horrible incident in, I think, 1951 or 52 where somebody had been killed by a gunshot in the grandstand at the Polo Grounds. It was fired from a rooftop of a neighboring housing project. So all of that figured in, but nobody wants to print too much of it at the time.
And today, fans are being held up in their seats by buying $10 beers. So,
well, yes, you could say that's somewhat voluntary, but
right.
Yes, robbery is robbery, I guess. Yes,
absolutely. You paint a different picture on it. I can't let you go today without. This is pre-election day, and you and I talk on Facebook every now and again. I have a basic idea of how you feel, but podcasting is for getting out one's thoughts and feelings. How do you feel about what's going on? Do you feel hopeful for whatever reasons that tomorrow will bring good news, or are you feeling pessimistic?
I'm feeling that tomorrow, I think, to try to be straightforward about it, I think the Democrats are going to retake control of the House. You'd have to have something awfully strange going on overnight for that not to happen. Just historically speaking, it's an off-year election. Usually the party that's in the White House loses seats in the House of Representatives. I don't think the Democrats will capture the Senate, but they will at least get one part of the government back, it would appear. If you're asking me whether I'm for or against that, I will answer that by saying that I had a few dealings with the Donald Trump organization when I lived in New York. I was at Penn at the University of Pennsylvania for the 2 years that he was there. His daughter, Ivanka, was in my son's class at prep school. So I've had some close contact with Donald Trump, and I wouldn't vote for him in a million years.
Okay. I concur, but I'm hoping that the Democrats get out the vote.
Oh yeah,
But
absolutely.
they're doing. I think everything will take care of itself if we get the numbers out there to vote. Because
well, as Joseph Stalin said, it's not who votes, it's who counts the votes. So, yeah, I agree with you. By the way, my dislike of Donald Trump, which I make no secret about, really has nothing to do with his politics. I just find him a vile human being. I'll come right out and say it. He's one of the three most obnoxious famous people I've ever met in my life. The other two are Howard Cosell, who I actually would have agreed with on most political things, and a guy named Al Goldstein. Do I need to remind you who he was? You probably remember.
I think it was Screw Magazine.
Screw Magazine, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
now, how does that come to mind so quickly for me? I don't. tells a lot. But he had notoriety. He was not a pleasant man. You're absolutely right.
He was horrible. Goldstein, yeah.
He was absolutely horrible. And I got to say, his cartoons were vile. More so than I've ever read, really. I'm thinking back in my mind, and I do remember that well. Howard was a character. I mean,
yes.
Of all the people, as bright as can be, he was an attorney before he went into the Army. I think he comes out. He just had this crazy ego going. You call it a New York ego, but you listened. If he was doing a game, you listened. People threw bricks at the TV station, but in the world of entertainment, it's not it's how many people, not what they think about you so much as do they tune in, and they tuned in for him. Quite a guy. Why did you find him vile? Why did you find him to be that way, personally?
Cosell we're talking about now?
Yeah.
I didn't find him vile. I just found him condescending and obnoxious. I worked in a store on the east side of Manhattan because I was recovering from illness, and he would come in, and he was just unpleasant to deal with. There were no smoking restrictions, and he would flaunt the cigar in the store. He was highly dismissive and disdainful of the staff. I was an assistant manager. He was just, I would have to say, intentionally unpleasant. And I'll footnote that by saying I didn't even dislike him. I just found him obnoxious. There is a gradation between the two. The other two people I mentioned, I can honestly say I actively disliked. Cosell, I could turn around and make a wonderful case for Howard Cosell. Following up on what you said, I think his political stance in favor of Muhammad Ali and defending Muhammad Ali was absolutely the right thing. Most people were not doing that. I can remember Cosell talking about how it was absolutely an abomination of what the boxing was doing to Ali. So I'll give the guy a lot of credit. It's personally abrasive.
And I think towards the end of his life, alcohol became a big part of that. And
yes. Another footnote is everybody loved his wife. I forget her name. I think it was Emmy or something like that.
Emma.
Emma. Yeah, and she was absolutely charming. And I used to know a lot of couples like that when I lived in New York. The guy was absolutely horrible to deal with, but his wife was an absolute gem, and they were always very, very nice to their wives, too. So what can I say? Life is complicated.
Yes, it is. Before we go, what was it about Trump in particular that got you in an uproar?
Well, I knew people he never paid. I knew buildings that in my neighborhoods that he basically changed the face of by destroying older buildings that really were viable, that had people living in them. Going back for a second, it was difficult if you lived in New York and you knew any private contractors to not see this constant, in New Jersey, this constantly going on where they're really happy. They got their bid was accepted to do some work for the Trump organization, and then they wouldn't get paid. and then they finally file a suit, and then Trump would get his lawyers out and countersue them, and they'd end up these guys settling for 40 cents on the dollar for what they paid for. Just the overt dishonesty, which I think we've seen even since he's been in the White House. So much misinformation and lies come out of the White House that it's hard to keep track of them. What offended you on Tuesday is history by Wednesday because there's something new. In terms
I'm going to ask you, what about his presidency that offends you the most? For me, it was when he interned kids in cages and separated them from their parents. We can name 12 things. Anything that comes to mind for you that you just shook your head and said, this is just over the top? For me, it was that. Anything for you?
Nothing has surprised me because he's basically behaving exactly the way he did when he was a private citizen. So nothing comes as a surprise. But, I grew up at a time, I was born in the Truman administration and grew up during the Eisenhower and Kennedy administration. And it seemed to me that what we as a country were trying to do at that time, even if we didn't agree with the president was trying to form a consensus and trying to lead in a positive way. And that is what has been missing. We've seen this at other places in history where, you turn one group against another group. And that, I think, is what really overtly disgusts me the most. Turning white people against black people, turning white middle America against immigrants. I could go on and on and on, but you know where I'm going with that. The whole divisive, dishonest nature of the administration.
Okay, we're coming to an end. I just want to end. I wanted to end on that. And if you're listening and you're kind of on the fence, what do I do? We got to get the Congress back and this, that, and that. If you're on the fence, listen to Noel. Listen to the words. Listen to the feelings in his voice about how the man is repulsive. Listen to the feelings in my voice, how the man repulsive me. Makes me embarrassed for the country. Germany is laughing at us. They don't laugh much in Germany. They're not much of a sense of humor I've found over the years, and they're laughing. Europe thinks we're clowns anymore. This is crazy. We got it. And the first thought, we took a big loss with the Supreme Court. Progressive liberals, no getting around that. We can't afford to give him 2 more years of free reign. We've got to get a Democratic Congress in there. I don't think we're going to get the Senate back. That's just my guess. Hope something happens that we do, but it's imperative that we get the Congress. So get out there and vote, folks. Appreciate that. You've been listening to the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. Noel Hynd is my return guest, and you're terrific. I hope you'll keep coming back in one form or another.
Thank you.
All right.
Spiritually.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
This is as before, to be continued. And again, vote tomorrow, folks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ralph. Take care.
Thank you, sir. The proceeding was a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production. Thank you for listening.